The snowstorm did not care that Ethan Cole was 18 years old and had nowhere to go. It came down hard and sideways, the kind of snow that finds the gaps in your clothes within seconds and settles cold against your skin like it belongs there. Ethan walked with his head down and his backpack straps tight in his fists, not because he had a destination, but because standing still felt worse. Behind him, somewhere in the dark and the white, was the house he had grown up in. The door had already closed. He had heard it, that soft, final click, and he had not looked back, because he already knew what looking back would give him. Nothing. A lit window, a silence where a mother's voice should have been. Richard had not even raised his voice. That was the part Ethan kept returning to as he walked. He had always imagined, in the vague way you imagine things you hope will never happen, that if it ever came to this moment, there would at least be noise, a fight, something that acknowledged the weight of what was happening. Instead, Richard had simply stood in the hallway with his arms folded and said, "Get out," the same way you'd tell someone to move out of a doorway, and that had been the entirety of it. 7 years of silence and small cruelties, and Ethan making himself smaller and smaller to fit inside that house, and it ended in 2 words spoken without even the dignity of anger. He had looked at his mother. He had needed her to look at him, just once, just for a second, and she had kept her eyes on the floor and her hands flat on the kitchen counter, and she had said absolutely nothing. Not his name, not wait, nothing. And that nothing was a sound Ethan knew he would hear for the rest of his life in the quiet moments, the way you keep hearing a song long after it has stopped playing. He had $7 in his pocket. His phone was dying. The snow was getting worse. He was 18 years old, and the world was enormous and indifferent, and he walked through it with 1 photograph tucked between 2 shirts in his bag. His father, squinting into summer sunlight, smiling the way people smile when they are not thinking about smiling, when they are just genuinely happy to be exactly where they are. Ethan had carried that photograph through every hard year since he was 11, the way sailors used to carry a fixed point in the sky to know which direction was home. His father had died when Ethan was 11, a car accident on a mountain road in winter. The casket had been closed. Ethan had stood at the funeral in shoes a little too tight and cried until he felt like there was nothing left inside him. And then he had gone on living, the way you go on living when you have no other choice, carrying the absence like a stone in his chest that never got lighter, only more familiar.
That was what everyone had told him. That was the only story he had ever been given. He walked for hours. The cold stopped hurting after a while and became simply the condition of existing, the way grief does after enough time. The town of Black Hollow materialized slowly out of the dark. A gas station, a diner with half its sign dead, a few houses set back from the road with their lights on inside, warm and unreachable as stars. On the edge of town sat a scrapyard, and Ethan might have walked straight past it if something hadn't made him slow down. He still couldn't explain what it was, some pull, some gravity. He stopped and looked through the chain-link fence at the rusted shapes of old trucks and gutted trailers half buried in snow, and that was when he saw the cabin. It sat on a trailer bed near the fence, and it was in terrible shape. Roof partially collapsed on one side, windows boarded at angles, wood so old and dark with moisture it looked almost black. It leaned slightly, the way things lean when they have been standing too long without anyone caring whether they fall. A handwritten sign hung from a nail on the side, "For sale, $7." Something about it made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he couldn't name. It looked like something that had been forgotten by the world. He understood that feeling in a way that went deeper than thought. An older man stepped out of a nearby shed with a cigarette burning between his fingers, frost thick in his beard, wearing a jacket too thin for the weather. He looked at Ethan the way people look at a word they almost recognize, with that particular careful attention, that slight narrowing of the eyes. "You buying or staring?" he asked. "Does it even stand?" Ethan asked. "Most days." When Ethan showed him the crumpled bills, everything he had in the world, all $7 of it, the man looked at the money, and then at Ethan, and then at the cabin, and something moved through his expression that Ethan couldn't read. A long silence passed between them, filled with wind and snow. "Take it," the old man said finally. "Why?" The man looked toward the mountains, their dark shapes barely visible against the dark sky. "Because some places choose people," he said quietly, and the words settled over Ethan like something heavier than a sentence ought to be.
Before he handed over the key, the man caught Ethan's wrist and held it, and his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "There's a room beneath the floor of that cabin," he said, very low. "Locked up. Been there the whole 20 years I had that thing." He released Ethan's wrist and stepped back. "I never opened it. Whatever's inside wasn't put there for me." He walked away into the dark of the scrapyard and did not look back, and Ethan stood alone in the blowing snow with a single brass key in his hand and the feeling of having arrived somewhere without knowing he had been traveling. The first night inside the cabin was cold and strange and wrong in ways he couldn't fully name, the wind finding every crack, the fireplace giving more smoke than warmth, dust thick over every surface. But it was shelter. Ethan sat on the floor near the weak fire with his blanket pulled around him and held his father's photograph in the firelight and looked at that familiar face and felt the old ache open up in his chest the way it always did, wide and quiet and bottomless. "I wish you were here," he said, and his voice sounded too loud and too raw in the silence, and the cabin creaked around him as if it had heard. And then something moved beneath the floor. A single heavy thud, deep and slow, coming from directly below him. He went completely still. Another thud followed, more careful than the first, almost deliberate, and then silence. Not the silence of a house settling or wind in the walls, the silence of something that had stopped because it heard him too. He crossed the room with his flashlight, and the old boards groaned beneath every step, and near the fireplace he noticed what he had not noticed before, a section of floor that was subtly wrong, the wood slightly newer, the grain running at a different angle, replaced years ago by someone careful enough to try to hide it, but not careful enough to fully succeed. He lifted the corner of the old rug beneath it, and there was a trap door, a metal ring set flush into the wood, ice cold against his fingers. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his hands. He pulled the door open, and cold air came up from below, not ordinary cold, but ancient cold, sealed cold, the cold of a place that had not breathed in a very long time. A narrow staircase went down into complete darkness. Every sensible part of him said to close the door and walk away. He went down anyway. The room below it was larger than the cabin above it. Concrete walls, metal shelves loaded with files and equipment, and old hard drives covered in dust. A long workbench with monitors sitting dark and silent. Maps covered an entire wall. Topographical maps, architectural diagrams, satellite images of something massive built inside a mountain, and handwriting everywhere. Sticky notes on folder covers, on loose sheets of paper. Handwriting that Ethan stared at for a long time before his brain let him recognize it. Because recognizing it meant something too large and too impossible to accept all at once. He picked up a folder. His hands were already shaking before he opened it. His father's name was on the first page, and the sticky notes on folder covers, on loose sheets of paper. Handwriting that Ethan stared at for a long time before his brain let him recognize it. Because recognizing it meant something too large and too impossible to accept all at once. He picked up a folder. His hands were already shaking before he opened it. His father's name was on the first page, and the second.
It was on every folder he touched, every document he opened, every report he pulled from the shelves. Daniel Cole, Lead Research Director, Project Wintergate, Classified. The man who fixed trucks in the driveway on weekends. The man who made pancakes from scratch every Sunday morning and laughed too loud in restaurants. That man had been living an entirely different life in the space beneath the ordinary one. And the weight of that truth came down on Ethan slowly, the way heavy things sometimes fall, not all at once, but settling, until you cannot move. Pinned to the wall among the maps was a photograph. His father, younger and sharper-eyed than Ethan had ever seen him, stood beside men in expensive suits in front of the facility from the diagrams. On the back of the photograph, in his father's handwriting, "If they find this, run." Ethan did not sleep. He read everything through the night, piece by piece, and by the time cold gray light began filtering through the cracks above him, he understood enough to know that his father's accident had never been an accident, that someone had wanted what his father built badly enough to destroy his life to get it, that Daniel Cole had not died on a mountain road in winter. Then he found the tape. A VHS cassette with a handwritten label, "For Ethan only." His hands shook so badly he could barely slide it into the player. The monitor flickered, static rolled, and then his father's face filled the screen, and the sound Ethan made was something he had no name for, something that broke open in his chest and came out of his throat without asking permission, because his father was there, right there, older and exhausted and frightened, but there, and for one raw and terrible and beautiful second, it felt like being 11 years old again, and having the one person in the world who made everything feel survivable look directly at him. "Ethan," his father said. The word alone was enough to make him collapse inward. His father spoke slowly, carefully, the way someone speaks when they have rehearsed a thing they could never fully prepare for. He explained the accident that was not an accident. He explained what he had built and what they had wanted to do with it and why he had refused and what they had done in response. He explained that disappearing had been the only way to pull the danger away from Ethan and his mother. And then he said something that broke Ethan in a way he had never been broken before. Not even on the night Richard said, "Get out." Not even at the funeral in the too tight shoes. "I watched you," his father said, and his voice fractured on the words, and his hands on the table in front of him were trembling. "Every year, from a distance, I watched you grow up, Ethan. Every birthday, every ordinary day. I was always there, close enough to see you, too far away to hold you, and there was not a single day I did not want to come home." The tears came down Ethan's face in silence, and he did not wipe them away. He could not move. He sat in the cold concrete room 20 feet underground and listened to his father's voice and felt 7 years of grief rearrange itself inside him into something different, something that hurt just as much, but differently, the way a wound hurts when it is beginning to heal. His father said a name, Victor Hale, and then the lights went out. Footsteps crossed the cabin floor above, heavy and multiple and purposeful, the footsteps of people who know exactly where they are going. A voice cut through the dark, cold and controlled. "Find the boy." A flashlight beam swept down the staircase. Ethan pressed himself into the corner and held his breath and closed his eyes. The beam swung closer. He heard his own heartbeat as though it were happening in another room. Then from outside, a shout, then gunshots, sharp and sudden, tearing through the night. Chaos above, shouting and glass and boots scrambling. And then, quiet. A silence so complete, it felt like the world had been switched off. Ethan climbed the stairs and walked to the cabin door and stepped out into the storm. A man stood in the snow at the tree line, 20 feet away,
His jacket was torn and dark with blood at the shoulder. His hair had gone gray. His face had been reshaped by years of fear,
hardening into something older and harder than the face in the photograph, the face in Ethan's memory. But his eyes were the same. They had always been exactly the same, and Ethan had been carrying them with him for 7 years inside a folded photograph without knowing they were still alive somewhere in the world, looking back at him. "Dad?" The word came out as barely a sound. Daniel Cole looked at his son, and whatever he had been holding together came apart completely. He crossed the snow, and Ethan met him, and they held on to each other in the middle of the storm with the kind of desperation that only grows in the space between people who love each other across impossible distances for impossibly long times. Neither of them spoke. There were no words. The snow fell softer now around them, the wind dying down to almost nothing, as though the storm had decided this moment deserved to be still. Sometimes the world takes everything from you before it shows you what was always yours. Ethan had walked out into that storm with $7 and a dead man's photograph and the fresh silence of a mother who could not save him, certain he had lost everything there was to lose. He had not known yet that losing everything was the only road that led here, to a forgotten cabin at the edge of a nowhere town, to a room buried underground full of his father's secret love, to the truth that the people we believe have left us are sometimes still out there in the dark, carrying a weight we were never meant to see, loving us in the only way the world had left them room to love, from a distance, in silence, across all the years that hurt them just as much as they hurt us, waiting for the moment they could finally come home.